Hello and welcome to All You Leaders and Strategy. I'm Mike Harris and welcome back to the latest podcast, which is part two of the interview with Alex Smith, the leading strategy expert and author. And we're now going to talk a little bit more about his book. Coming back to your book for a moment, one of the things, I'm going to show it to the camera again, just to give you the plug. One of the things I found interesting was your what you call the opposites test, which I'd never come across that before, even thought about it before. And I just wondered if you might want to expand on that and just explain to the viewers and listeners exactly what you mean by the opposites test, because I find it really interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, a few people have actually said it before. Rory Sutherland is one person who's got a different slant on of exactly the same idea. I think he says the opposite of a good. What's the opposite of a good idea? Another good idea, or something like that. Um, and essentially, what you're doing with the opposites test is you're teasing out one of the principal characteristics of bad strategy, which is uh, essentially to try and win on the basis of quality. So most companies, they think that they're going to win by being better than the other guy. So you'll say like, I've got a restaurant, my food is better than the restaurant down the street, therefore I'll be the more successful restaurant. Doesn't work that way. The market doesn't recognize better. The market only recognizes difference. And so the reason that the opposites game is clever, essentially what you do is you take whatever your strategy is, and then you ask the question, would the opposite of this also be a coherent strategy? If the answer to that is yes, then you've probably got a good strategy. If the answer to that is no, you've probably got a bad strategy. So let's use that restaurant example. And you said, my strategy is to have amazing food. You say, okay, what's the opposite of that? My strategy is to have awful food. It's clearly not a coherent strategy. And the reason is because you've built your strategy around an obvious category generic. There's no original thought there. There's no actual choice being made there. It is not an idea for a restaurant to have good food. Like, it's not an idea for a car to be able to start. It's not an idea for like a pair of shoes to be able to fit. There are some things that just like are required from the category. And so you haven't actually made a coherent choice there. What counts is to make a choice that somebody else might not make, and you can have a good faith difference, because that's what actually creates differentiation in the market, and that's what gives consumers genuine options. So we go back to the restaurant example. To say our strategy is to have good food is a completely stupid idea, because the opposite makes no sense. However, to give a very simplistic example, let's say you said our strategy is to have I don't know, extremely fast service. So like fast food. I know that fast food's a pre-existing idea, but pretend that someone was inventing the concept of fast food. What's the opposite of that? Well, we have slow service. And you're like, well, hang on, I can actually understand that like there's a place for fast food where I come in, get my food and get out. And there's also a place for a sort of an experience where I linger, like a romantic dinner, the opposite of fast food. It's yin and yang. These are both coherent ideas and they're opposites. Or another one a very simple one, which applies to every category, is that like if you say my strategy is to be extremely cheap, what's the opposite of cheap? Expensive. Well, every market can sustain a premium option and a budget option for the most part. So again, these are two coherent things to do. So that it might not be a good strategy, because obviously like those ones are not very unique, but at least they are strategies. Whereas if you don't pass the opposites test, what you're saying, we're not saying that your idea is a bad strategy. What we're saying is that it's not even a strategy at all. All you're doing is saying effectively, our idea is to be the same as everyone else, but a little bit more. And that's never going to work.
Yeah, and I think you're right, because and this is why I found it interesting when I read it in the book, is because when I go and speak to people, normally what they want to be is the biggest and the best and all of that. And actually, as you say, that's not a strategy. That's not even an ambition, really, just to be the best. It's a bit like me saying my ambition is I'd like to be 18. Well, it's just never going to happen. It's no, what's the definition of being the best? Who's taking that view? Who's making that choice? It's just not tangible. It's not. So therefore, you need to get a strategy, in my view, which actually links back to something that is actually going to happen and work. And therefore, what I like about that test is you're now actually thinking, am I doing anything different to the rest of the market? Because if there isn't an alternative, I can't be doing anything different to the rest of the market, because the rest of the market are doing exactly what I'm saying. So that's why I found the opposite test really good. Something else you mentioned in the book, which I want to just touch upon, is, and for me, this challenged me actually in my thinking, which is always good, is I spend a lot of time talking about competitive advantage and the importance of competitive advantage, and how, and I work with businesses to really identify what that is. And not just in the sense of sales and marketing, but also in the sense of how they deliver their products or services and how they make a profit. But within the book, you talk about refusing to compete, which at face value is diametrically opposed to the idea of competitive advantage. And
Yeah,
but it's a
message we had.
but it's a fantastic thought process, which again I found really interesting. So I just thought it might be useful for you to, and interesting for the viewers and listeners, just to understand what that refusing to compete idea is.
So refusing to compete is, as you've intuited, is ironically a means of competing, but it's a kind of thought experiment whereby if you compete with someone, by definition, that means you are fighting with them over the same thing. So if you look at like the world of sports, let's say, two football teams playing against each other, they're competing with each other in a zero-sum game. What's going to be the better football team on that day? That's sport. Business doesn't work that way, because as people talk about, it's like an infinite game, right? It's not a zero-sum thing. So if you try and beat another company, what that effectively means and compete with them is that you will try and outdo them, which in practice means that you will just become the same as them. They go left, you go left. They go right, you go right, because every step you're not letting them have an inch. They add this feature, oh, we've got to add that feature too, because you're trying to beat them. You're trying to kind of defeat them where there can only be sort of one left standing. It's a very, very unstrategic mindset, because what it basically encourages is commodification. So commodification happens when people try and compete with each other, and ultimately it just drives down profitability, prices, and all the businesses go bust. That's what happens when you compete. So what's the opposite of competing? Well, if you don't think about your competitors as enemies, but you think of them more as colleagues or collaborators, that means that you look at the market in terms of the fact that you are essentially trying to balance each other in the market. So be each other's, I said the term yin and yang before, be each other's yin and yang. So you think about, how can we position ourselves in such a way as that we drive a certain type of customer into our competitors' arms, and we take a certain type of customer into our arms, and we basically share the market in a symbiotic manner. So to give you a sort of like a simple example of this that I actually think, it's I don't know how true this is in practice, but it illustrates the point. If you think about the relationship between Haagen-Dazs and Ben and Jerry's, so they've been like kind of like two sort of big nominal competitors for a long time. There's actually such gigantic strategic differences between those two brands that they actually share the market in a reasonably peaceable and coherent way, because there's a certain type of person who wants to buy Ben and Jerry's and a certain type of person who wants to buy Haagen-Dazs. And although nominally they're competitors, they're not like Coke and Pepsi. They aren't like they're not trying to be the same thing and seeing who wins. They're actually very coherent things. And you reach this state of balance in the market, which is ultimately much, much more profitable for both brands. The dream state you're trying to get to, and of course this will never be fully reached, a perfect market. I talk about this concept of a perfect market. A perfect market is where every business in that market is so well differentiated that there is no competition whatsoever, because the trade in that market automatically sorts itself into the given brands within it. So if the only car brands on the planet, thought experiment, were Ferrari, Jeep, and Skoda, let's say, the the difference between those brands is so coherent that there would be no competition and everyone would be ridiculously profitable and everything would be sort of like shared accordingly. Now, of course, that's not realistic, but you can generate those sort of dynamic effects for your brand if you refuse to compete and you think of yourself as balancing with your competitors rather than beating them. That's how you will separate yourself from them and you'll avoid that trap of commodification.
Excellent. And as I say, it's really made me think about how I approach things. Maybe not. Hang on a sec. I keep getting messages coming up from emails. Maybe not. Maybe not in the sense that it's made me think competitive advantage doesn't exist anymore. But actually, the refusing to compete should be part of the process of thinking about what the competitive advantage is. So it kind of
Yeah,
it links into it.
The ultimate competitive advantage is to not compete at all.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we've talked about the book a lot. I'm also aware that through LinkedIn and elsewhere, you have your strategy shortcut system. And I just thought you might want to talk about that a little bit and explain what that is.
Yeah. Thanks for the tee up. It's early days, but like I said to you before, what I'm most interested in now is sort of delivering strategy at scale and helping the maximum number of businesses actually start to think in this way that most of them are just not thinking in at all. And obviously, I can't do billions of consultancy projects. So, strategy shortcut system is my effort to create something which can be disseminated at scale to sort of smaller businesses who aren't going to do a sort of like who aren't going to drop 100 grand or whatever on a sort of strategy consulting project. So it's essentially there's a course element and there's a kind of tool, a sort of glorified template, you might say, that you can run through certain exercises in order to sort of spit out a strategy at the end and certainly get you starting to think about your business in a strategic way, similar to the stuff that we talked about on this call, which, like I said, is a way that most founders have never really thought about the business. Most of them, like I say, they're thinking in the opposite way. They're thinking in the competitive, be the best, all the rest of it kind of way, which little do they know is sort of driving them to ruin. So that's what I'm trying to do and that's what I'm trying to do with that. And there's a sort of low version which is priced to the extent that absolutely everybody could do it. And then there's a high version which has a degree of feedback and involvement from me. So that would be for your slightly larger sort of business. When I say large in that context, I only mean 1 million turnover, that kind of territory, because it's these. That's the next generation of founders. That's the next generation of businesses, and I just want these basic precepts, and I really do think they are basic. These should be just like embedded in the head of anybody who's running a business. I think it's just criminal that they aren't, because they're not complicated. They're counterintuitive, but they're not complicated. It doesn't take a lot of time. And this is the difference between having leverage and not leverage. This is the difference between making multiples and not making multiples. These basic things. So, yeah. Hopefully, over time, I'll get more and more people through that, and it's one way of quickly and simply doing the exercise.
And if I can just add for the people who are watching and listening, I've subscribed up to it, and
oh, you have? I didn't clock that.
Partly so I can see what the competition are doing. No, not really, but mainly because I just think it's really good, and it's a bit like what I'm doing here with the podcast. Is I set up the podcast in the first place to see how do I take what I do and get it out to the widest possible audience that I can to help people who need to think about strategy in their businesses, but either they haven't got the time or they haven't got the money to be able to invest in somebody like myself on a regular basis. And what you're doing is a different approach at something very similar, which is how do you get what you do out to a wider audience. So I really commend you for that, and I think it's really good.
Yeah. And I think what's cool about it as well is that I do sense that there's a bit of a vacuum in obviously I'm doing a lot of promotion through social media. Obviously that's my main sort of channel and I'm investing more and more in that. And this is not, there are serious big beast strategic gurus out there who are much, better at strategy than I am. Like Roger Martin springs to mind as being probably the biggest name, but they don't exist in that sort of more lowbrow, bite-sized social media universe. And that is the kind of the tier of information where I think these type of ideas need to be disseminated. And it kind of blows my mind that nobody is really doing that in that space. So that's the sort of opportunity that I hope that I've kind of identified.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that sits with it is comes back to that old adage, people don't know what they don't know. So people don't know they need help around strategy if they don't really know what a strategy is. They don't understand what they're missing out on if they don't actually know what it is in the first place. So getting that awareness up is really important to help, particularly SMEs and startups. That's what I find anyway, because the larger businesses, they've probably got people like us in the business, either officially in the title and the role, or people have got expertise that they bring to it. But the smaller businesses, they don't have it, and they don't know that they're missing it because they've never had it. So I think it's really good to elevate the awareness.
Yeah, my crude estimation on that point is that when you say smaller businesses don't have it, the definition of small, I would estimate, is roughly under 500 million turnover. So we're not talking like a mum and pop business. I would say that businesses under the 500 million turnover mark do not do strategy. So yes, your Shell and people like that, yes, they do strategy, but we aren't talking about tiny businesses who don't do it. We're talking about what most people would consider very big businesses. So it's not just a problem for the little startups. It's a problem for serious organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming towards the end of the podcast, I think, and the interview, but just a couple of things. What advice would you give to aspiring leaders who are looking to become more strategic?
I mean, beyond just read my book or something like that. I think most leaders, their focus, where their head is at on a day-to-day basis, it's in the wrong place. They're looking downwards at what the business is doing, what its product is doing, how they're serving their clients. And they think that their main sort of like area of work is, okay, well, how can we keep on serving the customer better? That's what the operational people are there for. That's not what the leader's job is. The level of focus that a leader should have should be an industry focus. They shouldn't be worried about the customer. I'm not big on like customer focus type stuff. Where they need to be looking is on the level of, okay, what are the moves that we are making in our industry and how are we changing our industry? What is the change we want to see happen in the industry? So to give you a very simple example, imagine if you, let's say, ran a bakery, right? A lot of people who run bakeries, they spend all day thinking about the bread and about, whatever, and sort of like pleasing the customers who come through the door. That's the job of the person on the till and the person serving the bread. The person who owns the bakery shouldn't give a crap about that. They should be actually thinking about what play are we making in the bakery market. So if you think like, is he called Howard Schultz, founder of Starbucks?
I'm not sure.
It's something like that. I think that was it. Anyway,
Mr. Starbucks.
Yes, Mr. Starbucks. Was he a barista? Did he care deeply about coffee? No. He had a play that he wanted to make in the coffee industry. And so that's what I mean about, are you looking up at your industry and doing all your thinking there? Or are you looking down at your business and its customers and doing your thinking there? You got to look up. You've got to be thinking on an industry level. The second that you start thinking, what change are we trying to bring about in this industry? you're thinking strategically. And you were in a very, very rare group if you even ask that question, because everyone else is thinking operationally and they're thinking about serving the customer, which actually it's a downstream thing. Because you've got to bear in mind, just to use that serving the customer thing, depending on your strategic evaluation of what the industry needs, you might actually need to start serving your customers worse rather than better. Like Ryanair strategically serves their customers horribly for very, very good strategic reasons. So they made that judgment call and then acted accordingly. And that would be something that if you were just like looking down all the time, you would never do that. You would never deliberately give bad service. But actually, it could be a smart thing to do if you're thinking on an industry level. So that's like a good example of how like, you're going to be led astray if you're constantly thinking with a service mentality.
I think it's a great sort of bit of advice, and I guess I would say that because one of the things I say to my clients in making the step to being strategic and a leader, you've got to stop looking into the business and what the business does, which is probably what they've been trained to do up till then, and actually focus and look upwards and look outside of the business and look wider and look ahead, really, which is very similar to the sort of what you've just said, I think. So
it's so visceral, isn't it? That
yeah,
that looking up, looking down thing. You can just sort of feel it when you which one of those things you're doing. And
yeah,
looking up is so rare. And a little interesting tidbit as an aside, which I'm really taken with, is the Myers-Briggs test.
yes,
And you know that there's that one of the metrics in there is sensing versus intuiting, which broadly speaking is a sort of, are you a zoom in person or a zoom out person, or are you
yeah,
a sort of detail person or a concepts person? And the population at large, as I understand it, like the majority of people, 75% are sensing people, they're detail people, they're zoom in people, which of course is an incredibly useful skill for the vast majority of jobs. You can be a scientist, or like all sorts of jobs are zoom in jobs. But that's very useless for strategy, which is very much a zoom out job. And it can be very hard for people who are naturally a sensing person to force themselves into the zoom out mode. And one of the things, speaking for myself, I know from having done variants of that test throughout my life, that like I bury the needle very far on the intuiting thing. So I'm conscious that like my natural way of being lends itself to this particular way of thinking. And so sometimes giving advice can be a little bit disingenuous, because you're sort of saying, hey, this thing that I do by accident, why aren't you doing it too? Well, that's because you're doing something different by accident. So it can be very easy to sort of say, oh yeah, just do this, do this, do this. Isn't it simple? But for some people, it requires a real wrench from their normal way of being.
but there's another way of looking at it, I think, and funny enough, I had this discussion with a client last week who runs his business and runs it very successfully, but he is very much looking downwards and into it. And we were having the discussion, and I said, it doesn't have to be him. He just needs somebody in the business doing it. And if he's and actually, because I know the business quite well, I was able to identify the person who I thought had the skills and thought that way anyway, who could actually do that on his behalf. So it doesn't necessarily mean that he's got to change and be a different person to what he's been for the last 20 odd years. But the business still needs somebody to do it. And if he's comfortable delegating that and trusting somebody else to do it for him, then it's a win-win, because he can continue being what he's always been, and this other person, she can focus outward and look upwards and do essentially the more strategic. And as I said, the person running the business, and this is probably counterintuitive, the person running the business, who owns the business, doesn't have to be the strategic leader. But they do need to make sure there is a strategic leader in the business that they're going to trust and work alongside to deliver what needs to be delivered.
Very good point. And I guess that's obviously why you have the classic founder team thing, generally speaking, and
Yeah,
that's why the archetypal founder team is obviously Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who is the downward looker and the upward looker,
yeah,
and that's why Apple became Apple.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Last question. If you could just give 3 tips to our viewers, what would those tips be?
Um, so let me see. I would say step one, um, think about what you're doing in terms of being the only rather than being the best. Only is better than best is the pat idea for that. So that immediately will stop you falling into that better trap, which kills most people before they even start. You have to think about being the only company that does what you do. So then you'll tick off half of that equation I said at the beginning about being the only game in town for what you're selling. The next one is in order to generate a real innovation and to bring new value to the market, 9 times out of 10, that is going to involve some serious sacrifice. Most businesses, they don't think about what they're going to sacrifice to their competitors and what they're going to be bad at. But realistically, you probably have to pick something that your competitors are good at and you have to give it to them. You have to say, right, we are just not going to do that. And anyone who wants that thing, they should go to our competitors and we're cool with that. Because by sacrificing that thing, it opens up the opportunity for us to do something else, something the opposite, something incompatible, which is new, number one. And number two, our competitors won't be able to copy because, of course, the thing we're sacrificing is something that they have. This lack of sacrificial mindset makes it very, very hard for businesses to come up with innovations because they only want to think of this in an additive sense. They only want to think of it as in like, okay, we want to do everything our competitors do, and we want to do this other thing as well. Sometimes that happens, but these days, in this sort of late capitalism, millions of businesses in every market, those open goals, they don't exist anymore. You gotta sacrifice in order to generate something new. And then the final one I would say is whatever your idea is for your business, you have to narrativize it. You have to frame it in a story. And the shape of that story is, your classic sort of hero's journey type thing. It has to be something along the lines of what is the problem with this industry? What is the secret that we've realized that could change everything? What, therefore, are we going to do about it? Specific action, innovation, like a real thing, not just a vague, fluffy thought. And what value is that going to create for the customer? Like to me, a strategy is never like our strategy is to do X, where it's like this one like thing. A strategy is always a story. It's always something that's stretched over time. It's an argument. Think about yourself like a lawyer delivering your closing statement to the jury. That's the kind of feeling that a strategy should always have. And so, yeah, once you narrativize things, going back to our point about how like it's not about the idea, it's about how you communicate the idea, you're going to turn that crappy idea that you had into something that people are going to think, wow, that's a really good idea, purely because you've narrativized it.
Excellent. I always like to set the viewers and listeners some homework so they actually have to go off and do something and hopefully feed back to me on the outcome. Would you like to set a bit of homework for our viewers and listeners on something they could do?
Yeah, actually, one that you could do is it's a little bit annoying because it requires signing up for my newsletter, but you can just sign up and unsubscribe if you want to get the lead magnet, which is I've created the ultimate strategy document template, which is literally a template you can fill in to sort of describe your strategy, rather similar to what I just mentioned there. So you get it like free if you just like subscribe to the newsletter. So I would encourage people to do that, get their hands on the template, and have a go with their current business and see how they get on and see which bits of it are hard for them to fill in and see what thoughts it provokes.
Excellent.
That can be a fun little challenge.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for that, and thank you for joining me today. It's been a lot of fun, really interesting. Hopefully, you've got something out of it as well. Some
absolutely.
benefit to you. So I'd like to thank everybody for listening and watching as well, and hopefully you've enjoyed it and you'll come back and join me for the next show. Not sure what the topic's going to be yet, but I'll let you know in due course. Thanks for joining us. Bye.